live up to the information that it says in Torah regarding elections.
Which part?
Rabbi, you're live.
A lot of the things we said. Oh, I'm live, okay. Baruch Hashem, I'm alive because tonight's topic is kind of morbid.
Yeah, why do we have to talk about that?
The Grateful Dead.
Blame it on the parsha.
Oh, we don't go to the
Okay,
the
so let me
parsha.
introduce
Okay.
this week's parsha, Parshas Chayei Sarah. Of course, discusses the life of Sarah, right? But in essence, discusses in the beginning the passing of Sarah Yemenu. And so we're going to discuss a topic which is quite taboo in Jewish thought, and it's the topic of burial and end-of-life related situations. And before we talk about it, I'm going to just introduce a little bit of from the parsha itself, and a little bit of why this subject is considered a taboo subject, and whether it should remain that way or it should not. So, this week's parsha is very unique in the fact that it introduces two concepts that we've never heard of before in the Torah. It's the first time it's actually going into it in detail. And that is two very opposing concepts, one being that of a burial. Sarah has passed away. People passed away in all the other parshas. The Reisha talks about a lot of people that died. We had Mables, there's been many deaths. Finally, we have Parshas Chayei Sarah discusses the concept of a burial, of what to do when a person passes away. And because, as you know, there are many different customs amongst different societies of what to do after death, what to do with the body, or as some of them call it, the cadaver, what is it called?
Cadaver.
The cadaver. I find that is a very strange name. Very mundane name, the cadaver, the lifeless corpse. And the Torah here tells us that Avram Avinu searched for a place to bury Sarah, and he paid a lot of money, 400 shekel kesef, 400 silver coins, which ended up costing us a long time. He created the 400 evil men of Esav, till this day we're working on getting those coins back from Ephraim. As the Arizal has a whole sefer called Arba Mea Shekel Kesef.
Really?
The whole sefer is on that. Yeah. Created a sefer, explaining how do we undo the damage done by this 400. Now, we obviously can't blame Avram Avinu. This was the way God wanted it to be the treasure hunt. The 288 sparks that fell from Torah weren't enough. Hashem wanted to add a few more of it's basically an investment the way it's called. That Hashem invest Kedusha into Klippa for the sake of refining the Klippa and elevating more Kedusha with it. So this is what happened to 400 shekel kesef. Paid a lot of money to bury her there in Mar Samachpela. So that's really going to be our focus, to try to understand a little bit about burial ceremonies and the concept of burial b'chlal according to Halacha, and cremation, etc. And the second part of this week's parsha, which is contradictory to this message, is of course marriage of Yitzchak and Sarah and Rivka getting married in Lent, is discussed in this week's parsha. So we have the first burial and the first wedding in the Torah in the same parsha taking place. So let's start off with the first question. According to Halacha, is one responsible? Does one have to? Is there a mitzvah to bury a dead person? And when I say the term bury, I mean in the ground. Is there an obligation to bury them, or can one use any method of, for the term, disposal as they would decide? Must the person be buried? This really touches upon, cremation or other means that different societies use to deal with a body after death. Does the Torah mandate a person to actually bury the dead?
Yes. And
if so, is it biblical or rabbinical? And if so, why? So that's what we want to get to. So, in truth, this matter is debated amongst Rishonim, and I'm going to start from the beginning. We have, even though our parsha does discuss the mitzvah of, does discuss Avram, buying a plot of land to bury Sarah, there's actually no command written there, and it's not listed as a command. We don't learn from that story that a Jew has an obligation to bury, a deceased loved one. Where we do learn from is from a very later event, discussed in Parshas Kitzeitze. And that parsha discusses capital punishment when Bezdin, hangs an individual or gives another one of the capital punishments. And it says, "Kavod tikberenu," that you have to, the wording there is "Kavod tikberenu," you shall bury him. V'leisalon ala eitz ad halayla, he may not remain hanging until the nighttime. And this is unanimously agreed upon. It's one of the Taryag mitzvahs that whenever capital punishment was given by the Sanhedrin, it was an obligation. You couldn't leave the person hanging for days. It was an obligation to take him down. Usually the way it was done is that all the Arba Mises Bezdin were hung for like 2 seconds. They were placed on the noose right before Shkia and taken down right away. And they were then buried. They had an obligation to bury them before nighttime. So everyone agrees upon it. What about all the rest of the jury? So the Gemara in Sanhedrin discusses this. Rabbi Yochanan is of the opinion that not only is it biblically required to bury every single Jew who has passed away, but furthermore, in the ground, right? That's what we mean by bury. But furthermore, it includes both a positive command and a negative command. A person who buries the dead fulfills the mitzvah deraisa kavod tikberenu, meaning it's not limited to people who died with the capital punishment. And number two, a person who doesn't bury the dead transgresses the isur deraisa of leisalon, thou shalt not, delay the burial. So there's a biblical and there's a positive and negative command that applies to burial. And the Alter Rebbe explains this in the Shulchan Aruch in the following way. This command is not just that you have to bury the dead, but that you have to bury them right away. You can't delay the burial. And this is why, as we're going to go into later, there's, in Judaism, it's not just about getting him buried, it's about getting him buried as soon as possible, and not to delay the burial at all. And someone who delays that everyone agrees upon, that, those who learn, as we do Halacha, that burying is not just regarding the capital punishment individuals, but every Jew has a biblical obligation to be buried. And this, of course, would be on the relatives, right? The 7 relatives of the deceased. They are the ones who have this biblical obligation and positive, negative command to make sure that that loved one gets buried. And if they don't, they transgress. They can say, well, I didn't like the guy anyways. I got into a big family fight with them. It doesn't matter. If you are one of the 7 relatives with a chiyuv d'oraisa, positive and negative to bury them, and if a person delays it, they transgress. Very serious prohibitions. Now, regarding the subject of exactly who's responsible, you have 7 relatives, right? So, maybe he should do it. He's the brother, he's the son, he's the father. It's already another discussion. But the concept should be known that this is mainly upon the relatives. If someone died without relatives, then of course it would be the community's responsibility. If some person in Islam that doesn't have any next of kin or known relatives here in Tzfas passes away, the whole community has a mitzvah deraisa to get this person buried. That's why we have a Chaver Kadisha. Chaver Kadisha is our representatives to make sure that gets done. Okay, so the Alter Rebbe novelized the following points. That the positive command is regarding daytime.
What?
The positive command, kavod tikberenu, you shall bury him, is regarding the daytime. That if he passed away before sunset, he must be buried before sunset. And if you don't, you transgress the positive command. The negative command of leisalon, second part of that verse, is that if he passed away at night or passed away by day and already transgressed the positive command, he must be buried before morning. If he's not buried before morning, he transgressed leisalon. So this is why we always try in the Chaver Kadisha and all, whenever a loved one has passed away, to try to make the funeral and burial as soon as possible. Now we do find an exception to this rule, that a person is allowed to delay the burial, and that is for mitigating circumstances that have to do with the benefit or respect of the person who passed away. So one of those major things is that people being able to join the funeral. if, it's more respectful for the sons and the relatives to make it
If
in
they come
town.
from Chutz La'aretz or
They
something.
come from Chutz La'aretz. So technically, to delay the funeral for the sake of relatives coming, or for the sake of, let's say, being, obviously not for just one lone individual, but let's say, this is a big popular individual and he can have
Before Shabbos, so it's
5,000
going into
people come to his
Shabbos.
Levaya. So that is a justifiable calculation to delay a burial for that purpose. And this is done all the time in most of the world except Yerushalayim. In Yerushalayim, there's a Messiah. You don't delay the burial for any purpose, for any reason. And therefore, if a relative isn't there, a relative found out in the States, they need to take a flight, it's already going to be past Shkia, they're going to miss the Levaya. In Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, they never delay the burial. It's always done that day, before Shkia. If it's at night, they do it before Alei Shachar, as the literal law is. Not because they have to, but because that's the Messiah, that's a tradition that they accepted.
For the Sephardim as well.
Yeah, this is Messiah of Yerushalayim, Sephardim, Ashkenazim. Now, it could be you have like 30 different Chevra Kadishas in Yerushalayim, and let's not forget today Jerusalem is not the same Jerusalem as back then. So it could be in the outskirts, suburban areas, that would say, well, it's not really real Jerusalem, therefore we can delay and we can wait. Depends.
How literally, in other words, let's say theoretically a person dies at 9 p.m. Are you saying that in Yerushalayim they would have a 3 a.m. funeral?
Ideally, yes. If the Chevra Kaddish is able to do it, yeah. Yeah, you have many funerals in Yerushalayim, which almost nobody's there, and it's done quickly at night, because they're not able to, because they're makbid to do it before Alei Shachar.
You don't have to have a minyan?
Yeah, no, you don't have to have a minyan. Now, it happens to be that in most Chevra Kaddishas in the world, at least back in the day, today it may be a little different, they used to avoid burying at night. Even though we just said there's a negative command to delay against delaying it, it's because people wouldn't show up. People wouldn't show up to the Levi, so it'd be honor of the mace to delay it till morning, but people could show up. But as I said before, in Jerusalem, they don't use this heter of pushing off a funeral. They don't use this heter of pushing off a burial, and they do it right away.
What about going into Shabbos?
So if they have time, they will bury before Shabbos. If they don't have time, they don't have time. If someone passed away 5 minutes before Shkia, well, even in Jerusalem, what are you supposed to do? There's nothing to do. They're not. The point is, in Jerusalem, we don't delay it based on these external reasons. But a delay, which is not a delay that's dependent on you, it takes time to do the Torah, it takes time to... But yes, in Yerushalayim, if, let's say, they have an hour till Shabbos, then they will do a shortened version of Torah. They won't do the full Torah. They will do a very much shortened version. So the burial can take place.
This is only in Jerusalem.
Only Yerushalayim. Mm-hmm. And as I said, not all areas of Yerushalayim. Today Yerushalayim is very big. New neighborhoods are not necessarily under that same old minhag.
And there's only one Yantif anyways, it doesn't matter in here.
What's that?
Yantif, in Israel doesn't matter, but in the rest of the world, people will bury on second day Yantif.
Usually today it's not done for the same reason I said. They want people to come. They want relatives to come. But Chevra Kadisha is going to bury somebody's father without letting his kids know. But Chevra Kadisha is going to do such a thing. On Yantif, and you can't call. So it's usually, today it's very rare to have a burial on Yantif Sheni. Okay. There's other issues also involved that we see regarding the respect of the dead, which I'm going to touch upon in a moment. That will touch upon the issue of cremation. That'll touch upon autopsies and why we see it's such a sensitive subject. All the time you hear the police want to do an autopsy, and there's suddenly a huge afgana, a huge protest against that. So we're going to discuss a little bit about that. But I said before we want to discuss, is the subject taboo? Should we not discuss? I want to go back to that point of discussing the laws of Avelis. So the world says that we avoid learning the laws of Avelis because it's a bad omen to be. We don't want to learn topics that are bad omens. So most of the world avoids learning the laws of mourning, like completely. Don't learn it at all. Well, okay, except for Tisha B'Av and except if you're doing the Daf Yomi and you're learning Ma'id Katan. Yeah, there's a few exceptions, but in the Shulchan, most don't open up the Shulchan Aruch of Hilchos Avelos and learn it, properly. And Rabbi Yehuda Chassid in Sefer Chassidim writes the following. Listen to what he writes. Just like we find that if you're walking, and God forbid you see a dead body, a dead Jew, you have a mitzvah deraisa, meis mitzvah, to pick him up and bury him, so too, if you're walking through a subject in Torah that nobody learns, you have a mitzvah to pick it up and learn it. And then he writes, for example, the laws of Avelos, it's a meis mitzvah.
Who says this?
Yehuda Chassid.
That's what he said?
Yeah, Rishon, 1,000 years ago. It's a Rishonim, early Rishon in Ashkenaz.
Tell us it's a gula for long life, just before you go on, please.
Well, he does say that those who learn it, will learn it properly. So those who learn it properly, that on the contrary, it will be a blessing. So he does give those blessings towards. When he says specifically, it's a greater mitzvah to learn these subjects because people know. At the same time, it's not something that. Nonetheless, the minhag is that only Rabbanim really learn it properly, but there are certain things that people need to know because when things happen, they don't have the time or the mental ability to figure them out. So we're going to touch upon, we're not really going to learn right now the laws of this, we're going to touch upon more of the subject of burial, which is more of a general subject. So let's now go through, what's the reason that the Torah says that this is what happens to a person? What's wrong with what is the chosen approach of most of, I think it's Asia and the Eastern world today, which is to burn the body and have ashes, crematorium. What's wrong with that? I mean, I guess it sounds a little nasty to us, but what's wrong with it? So the Torah says like this. It's very interesting, and this is what connects to the marriage. As we know, there's two worlds. There's this world, and when the soul leaves the body, it goes to the next world. The Zohar explains that a Jew's body and his neshama are like a husband and wife. And which Zohar is this? This week's. Chai Sarah. It says that Sarah is the guf, Avram is the neshama. And just like Avram Avinu was crying and couldn't leave until Sarah would be buried, he couldn't continue life until Sarah would be buried, so too the neshama cannot go up to heaven and continue whatever mission it needs to continue until its body is buried. It links to its body, even after death. It's connected to the body like a husband is connected to his wife. So Zohar says more. That after a person passes away, life doesn't end, life just begins. A new life begins, a spiritual life. And there's many different ways that this new life can go. Sometimes the neshama has to right away already go to Gan Eden. Sometimes the neshama has a next Gilgal awaiting him, says the Zohar, that same day.
What would it be?
He's going to be born now, a little new baby boy or new baby girl. That same day. Says the Zohar, if a person delays the burial, the neshama can't go anywhere until its body is buried. And that's why the burial has to take place. Not just we have the mitzvah of burial, but the burial must take place as soon as possible. There's a special connection between the earth and the body. That's where the body was made from, Adam Rishon. That there's no closure for the soul until the body returns to the earth. And that is being physically digging into the earth, placing the body there, and then covering up with earth. That action brings closure to the soul. The soul knows that its body was taken care of, and it can move on. But until that happens, the soul cannot move.
There are many catacombs where they're not really buried in the earth, they're buried like in ledges and so on.
Very good. So this, of course, brings up the question of the new modernized burial system here in Israel, in which they have an acclaimed major problem that there isn't enough land. Now, the truth is that's a lie. There's plenty of land. There just isn't enough land in the zoned areas of those cities. That's agreed upon. Tel Aviv, Gush Dan, doesn't have enough burial plots earth burial plots within the zone cemetery areas. There's obviously plenty of room in Israel to bury. But if they would only...
We don't have that problem here in Tzfat, right? As far as I know.
No, we don't. But in Goldstein and other cities, they do. And this created an idea to resolve this problem. Not instead of them saying, well, let's just open up an area south of Beersheba for 10 million graves for the future 100 years of Israel. Let's continue building in the cities, and instead of burying in the ground, we'll bury in what's called komot, in like little cupboards, closets that are laying one on top of the other. And of course, the halacha question comes up: is this considered burial? So, if the halacha says like this, in Chab and Shulchan Aruch, the closure for the neshama, as we explained in the Zayar, as well as the mitzvah deraisa of burying the dead, is only with earth. That's why cremation is completely negated according to Torah. One of the reasons, because you're not burying it. You're burning the body, you're not burying the body.
If you burn the ashes, it's going into the earth.
That's what's left doesn't need, it's not chayv k'vura anymore. Ashes do not need to be buried. Not chayv k'vura. Only the body's chayv k'vura. So we'll go to cremation afterwards. If someone chas v'shalom did it, and all the other asurim involved in doing so. But nonetheless, regarding this new modernized system of burial, which is here in Tzfat says, yes, correct, we don't have that problem, but in the rest of it, in Jerusalem, Goldstein, and all the central cities, we have this, in Haifa, we have this issue, where let me give you a little more information. Officially, the Bituach Leumi, over the last, I think, 10 or 15 years, took upon themselves to pay for burial expenses. Any Israeli citizen who's a resident of Israel has the right to have a burial a plot, the Chevra Kadisha, the whole 9 yards, funded by Bituach Leumi. They pay the Chevra Kadisha. You don't have to pay a dime. Meaning the relatives don't have to pay anything. However, they decide what type of burial the deceased will get.
Who is they?
Well, the Chevra Kadisha, and they're the ones that form Bituach Leumi. So the Chevra Kadisha of Tel Aviv will only bury you in these komot. The Chevra Kadisha of Yerushalayim will only bury you in these komot, in these. They call them the garage. I think it's there's a certain name for it. How they call it. How they refer to it.
Unless you pay them an
one of them is
extra money.
komot. No, if you go private, you can go by Yerushalayim. You know how much your grave costs privately. Minimum 40,000 shekel. Minimum starting price. If you get Harazesim under the Chevra Kadisha of Chabad, you can get it for 30,000 for Labavner's only. 30,000 shekel. That's the price of a grave, of a real grave in the ground. But
A single
otherwise,
grave.
of course, single, one person.
Not multiple layers.
No, yeah, in the ground.
Otherwise,
No,
if
but-
you went on
Multiple layers is free.
No, multiple layers underground.
Multiple layers underground. I am not aware of that. What they have in Har, if you're referring to what they have in Har HaMenuchos, that's debatable if that is defined as underground. Let's explain a little bit about this.
Okay, later.
Oh, no, we're going to explain that now. Okay, you have the Mechaber writes in Shulchan Aruch. If a person took the mace, the body, and he placed it into a casket, and he left it there in the casket, he transgresses the positive and negative command of burial. Transgresses leisalim, delaying burial. The mace is not considered buried. There's no burial did not take place. Burial is in the ground. That's very clear from the Shulchan Aruch. So now we have the following: if a person goes ahead and places the mace in this cupboard that they created, there's no earth there. It's not inside the ground, so it's not a kosher burial. It's not a kosher burial. The relatives are transgressing at every moment.
Could they put earth on in the...
They don't put earth in it. They don't put anything in it. So we have here a major halachic debate. We have some Rabbanim who came out and defended this type of burial. How? Because it's not that simple, as I said, that you're just taking closets and cupboards and packing one on top of the other and putting the mace inside. As the Mechaber clearly writes, you put it in an arid, in a casket, and you don't bury it, it's no good. They're actually attaching it to the ground. And that's touching on your point. It's actually attached to the back of a mountain. So that it's actually underground, or sometimes it's overground, but it's attached to stone. So can we consider that as ground or not? Is that considered as if it was buried in the ground or not? Because it actually, interesting, doesn't have to be literally earth. It can also be pebbles. It can also be, it doesn't have to be buried.
You cut a kuch in the rock.
Concrete?
In many,
You cut into the rock.
in
Like
these
the
places,
catacombs.
well, no, in these places don't come to the rock. It's literally like a cupboard. They open it up, they slide it
I know
open,
it is,
put the
yeah.
body inside. But I'm saying, in other places where they do burials in the ground, it's not earth. They're putting basically rock, filling it with rock inside. It's not actual earth. It's like pebbles. So based on that, maybe you can say that since it's attached. So this is a major debate. A number of Gedolei HaPoskim have cited and ruled that this is not considered a kosher burial. This was the position of Moshe Feinstein. This was Moshe Feinstein.
Uh-huh.
This was the position of Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, Rabbi Yoshev, and a lot of Gedolei HaPoskim. And they basically rule that this is not a burial for any
Is there a
purpose.
Chabad position as such?
No, Rabbi never discussed it. There is no Chabad position. There is no Chabad position, but the general Haredi approach of it is, as Gedolei Rabbanei of the Haredim, is that it's not considered a kosher burial, and therefore the Haredi world goes through the arms and lengths to make sure that the nifter gets a proper burial inside the ground and not inside the kumah. Now in Har HaMenuchos, it's a little more complex, because there it's literally inside the mountain. It's like dug inside the mountain they made these kumot. So it's not like in other places where it's just there's a mountain that's standing up and it's attached to the back of it, but it's actually underground. So that's also under debate, but I'm saying the debate is a little less in that situation. But this is a debate that's been going on now for 15 years, and there will not be an end to this debate. There's sides that it's okay, the sides that say it's not considered a burial. And of course, the sides that say it's not considered a burial, they say you're transgressing all the transgressions of not burying the dead, the neshama is not able to move on, it has a gilgul waiting for him, there's a little baby needs to be born, all that stuff's not going to happen. They say you can't do Avedas, don't sit Shiva. Don't sit Shiva, you can't start Shiva until they bury him properly. Yeah, so it's a complex situation. Of course, what will make everybody happy is if they just opened up space, if they opened up zoning to do burials as it always was. Now, the truth is that the basis of this type of burial that the allowers, the matirim, are coming from, they say, look, a lot of the Tanaic burials, as you can even see here in Sfas, took place in what's called kuchen. They made a cave, and they made holes in the cave, cupboards, and they would slide the mace into the cupboards. So it's the same thing. In other words, if a person thinks that it's not considered a real burial because they didn't take a shovel, dig out earth, put the mace inside, and then cover it with earth, that's clearly incorrect. Everyone agrees that is not the only definition of burial in Judaism. We see Tanaim right here in Tzfas that were buried in a different way. But the question is this new type of kuchen that they created the same similarity of what we see here? What we see here is a complete cave. Everything is inside the ground. There's no added material. They're buried basically in a hole in the earth.
In the rock.
In the rock earth. I said before, pebbles, rock, earth, it's all the same. But here, this is all artificially made. This is all artificially made. It just happens to be that the back of it is attached to a mountain. It's a little bit.
Maybe.
Maybe it's attached. Hopefully it's attached. So that's the difference that makes all the difference. Bottom line is that
This would keep the body this would keep the soul from going on if they're wrong?
if it's not a real burial, as Zaire says, it's like the person lost a loved one and doesn't know what happened to them. They don't have closure.
Soul's
The
not
husband doesn't know where his wife is. He's not going to go remarry somebody.
the soul, you said, isn't going on either up or back into another body. It's just, that's very serious.
The same way we have in this world the concept called closure, where everybody wants closure for tragedy, for different things that happen in their lives. They want closure. They want to move on. Using the example of chas v'shalom, if something happened to a loved one and you don't know what happened, knowing what happened brings closure. Well, the soul knowing the body has finally rested in peace. And that's why, very interestingly, all the world uses the term rest in peace. And I always wondered at that term, if you're not a religious person, why are you saying the term rest in peace? What does resting in peace have to do with that? He's dead. He's not going anywhere. Because until the person's buried, there's no peace. Once the person is buried, then we can finally say rest in peace. The neshama can finally have closure and move on to something else for its next mission. And yes, if a proper burial did not take place, it's something very serious. Now, what happens with someone who chas v'shalom is burnt? Well, we have crematoriums. Let's say in the Holocaust, we had millions of Jews that were burnt. We have chas v'shalom, somebody who passed away in a fire.
9/11.
9/11.
Just happened
9/11.
happened today on Route 90.
Right. 9/11 is a perfect example where there was nothing left. There was literally nothing left of people. So, and what happens in those situations? So the Zohar doesn't discuss those situations. I'm sure Hashem has a way of working those situations out. But let's focus more on the idea of someone choosing chas v'shalom, cremation as a choice of, disposal after they pass away.
God forbid.
God forbid. So what are the issues with that? So the issues with it is, first of all, number one, what we just said, the prohibition, the obligation of burial, which is not being fulfilled. Number two, there's another biblical prohibition against defiling the body of the dead. The same way we have an obligation to bury, there's a grave prohibition against defiling the body or belittling the body. And we basically treat this body, and we're not going to go through the Tahara process, not relevant to our discussion, but in the Tahara process, there's many, many things that are done to the mace, which is basically all about preparing him, preparing the body for the next world. And, tremendous care is taken to the mace, and in some svarim, the lashon is brought like you're preparing him for Shabbos or preparing him for a wedding. And so tremendous, tremendous respect is taken to the body, and it's a very grave prohibition of doing anything belittling to the body. So, of course, burning the body, it defiles the body in a very severe way, and it transgresses those two prohibitions and doesn't allow the soul to move forward, as we said before. And this is why when they first began coming out with it, and I believe the 1800s, as a form of burial, a form of disposal of the body, all the Rabbanim came out against it. All Gdei Yisrael came out tremendously against for these reasons. And to the point that somebody who chas v'shalom made that decision, first, number one, you don't have to listen to him, even though generally we say you have to follow the words of the mace, you have to follow his...
He had in his will, he wants to be cremated.
So if you have a way to legally avoid that, following through with that will, then you have the right to avoid cremating him and burying him a regular burial.
What's a way?
What's away?
What's a way?
The
Right,
executor,
so,
the executor of a will can make a decision other than what the will says, as far as that particular Indian is concerned. And the next of kin can also fight it out and get it
Depends on the
done.
state. I looked into this in the United States. In the United States, every state has different laws. I was once asked a shayla about this from an individual, called me up, said, listen, I'm a Lubavitcher, my mother just passed away, my mother had in her will cremation. What do I do? So I had to do some research for him. I looked into different state laws. And this was a number of years ago, I don't remember right now. Basically, I told him he has to speak to a lawyer because in Pennsylvania, he was in Pennsylvania. In Pennsylvania, it wasn't very clear. It wasn't that, if she wrote it in the will, that's it, that's the way it is. It wasn't,
Connecticut.
well, maybe you can come.
In Connecticut, when I did wills for people, and they would say, "Is my desire to be cremated?" So it was not binding, and in fact, the body.
Because of the wording?
Because the body becomes the property
Heirs.
of the, right, of the, let's say,
That's
it was
very
the husband and wife of the
Really?
wife, and therefore the wife can say, no,
Wow.
I will decide
So
how it's
that's-
going to be,
that's very
even if
interesting.
my husband requested to
So
be
even if
cremated.
even if they wrote in a much stronger term, I demand to be,
They didn't have the right to demand.
I understand.
It's only a
So, okay,
request.
so there you go, that's Connecticut law. I know Pennsylvania is not that lenient.
Right,
They're a
but
little
you, as
more.
you're saying,
they give
every
more-
state would be different.
Every state's different. They were a
Florida
little
and-
more strict. I had to, send him to a lawyer to deal with this, to find out what he can and cannot do. As far
Both
as-
Florida and New York, we were able to, next of kin or the executor were able to.
Yeah, so these are things that
Override.
a person has to look into right away and be able to try to protest it. To our great unfortune, here in Israel, legally a person cannot overturn it.
Cannot what?
Cannot overturn it. The
Really?
person wrote in his will. Well, that's as far as I know right now, based on research I've done and based on a Supreme Court ruling that came out about 8 years ago from the Supreme Court of Israel. This went to the Supreme Court. Religious next of kin protested the cremation, and which is Baruch Hashem quite rare. Most people in Israel do not choose, to cremate as an option. But there's only one. There should be none. But there is one active oven crematorium in Israel, in central Israel. But as I said, there's only one. There's not a lot of people who choose this. But in this specific case, it made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ordered that the will has to be followed. Now, I don't know if that means in every case. I guess we'll leave that for a lawyer to study the exact, wording of the verdict and on what basis. But the idea was that you have to respect.
Was this
the
a
will.
Chiloni person to begin with?
I'm not sure. I don't know those details, but that was the detail. They had in their will that they wanted to be cremated. The next of kins refused. They didn't want it, and I guess one of the other relatives fought it, and they won in the Supreme Court. But so every country has their laws, and it's something that we need to look into, that a person, a relative, we need to look into, and they can't just say, well, you know what, it's, just going back to what we said, the Shiur, a burial is upon all the 7 relatives, which is a brother, a sister, a father, a mother, a son, or daughter. Okay?
And a spouse.
And a spouse. It's on all those relatives. And therefore, a person can't say, well, it's my long-lost brother, I don't talk to him anyways, or, I view him as a distant relative, and if his kids want to do that, I don't care. No, you have an obligation to have him buried. So if a person is able to legally fight it, he would have to try to do so. Now, a person doesn't have the ability. If anyways they're not going to listen to this relative has no say. Okay, so you don't have a choice, what can you do? And then a person would have to ask a shah, do I have to sit shiva? Serious shah. If no burial took place, how can you sit shiva?
Shiva is connected to death.
No, shiva is connected to burial. Shiva doesn't begin till
So
burial.
if there's a cremation, you don't sit Shiva?
A number of Sfarim have written that, and it's based on the fact, as the Mechaber rules, that the person was placed in an Arum, they were never buried. Shiva is the next stage. You can't go to the next stage if you didn't do the burial.
But this is a psak as far as...
This is what they write. Practically, I have never gotten this specific question, and I have talked about the subject with a few G'dei Harabanim of the Chevra Kadisha here in Eretz Yisrael, and I haven't gotten from them a clear-cut answer of what to do.
What about Kaddish?
Oh, Kaddish they can say if they want. If they want, they can say it, but the approach that's written in a number of Sfarim, including Darkei Chaim of the Rav, the head of the Chevra Kadisha of Crown Heights in the 1950s to 1970s. So there he writes that no Kaddish, you don't say Shiva.
No Kaddish?
Nothing. But I know from other Rabbanim that they say you could say Kaddish, but no, you don't sit Shiva, you don't do anything. But again, it depends. Once 9/11 victim, we tell a 9/11 victim you don't sit Shiva because, no, a person didn't do it b'mezid. A person didn't do it, it wasn't his choice. Chas v'shalom, we won't apply that in those situations. We'll sit Shiva anyways.
No such thing as
So the question
Leilu
is-
Nishmas. Leilu Nishmas is not an
So the question is, as I said before, when it's something that's, it happened
Beyond
under
our
duress,
control.
it happened, beyond the control, or what we want to consider today as a tinik shenishba. The person was a tinik shenishba, so that would, you would have more of a lenient approach. You would say, okay, so it's not like the sperm that wrote on this issue, 60, 70 years ago, had a very different outlook on unobservant jury than we have today. So it could be that this would today, take a different stance. Okay, based on what we explained, we can also understand a little bit regarding the stance that we ought to have regarding autopsies. The question of autopsies came up in the times of Chassam Sofer and the Rabbi Yehuda, and they wrote a number of chuvas responses regarding it. Ideally, there's no reason to do an autopsy on the body. What use does the body have? The body's dead. You bury the person. There was no use of doing or need to do an autopsy. Over the years, the advancement of technology, it allowed that through doing an autopsy, you can come up with certain discoveries that can be of value, either to a currently running medical examination, a medical study, a scientific study of a certain kind regarding the body and effect of illness, or regarding a criminal investigation. Those are two things that often an autopsy is done for, to either help the medical world or help an ongoing investigation. How does Halacha look at it? So, in the times of Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Yehuda, the question was more on the medical side, not on the criminal investigation side. I don't know if in the 1800s there was forensic evidence, a concept of that, of connecting anything with the body, but probably not. But regarding medicals, there was. So it became, in the 1800s, it began becoming very popular for a person who passed away from an illness, for doctors to want to dissect the body, the cadaver, and check it out. What's going on in here? What was the effect of the illness? Maybe this can help save lives of other people. Gedolei Yisrael, led by the Rabbi Yehuda and others, vehemently opposed this. They vehemently opposed the allowance of an autopsy for the following reasons. First, number one, it often delays the burial. We already learned there's an obligation to bury the dead. Who says you can hang this person's soul in balance, hold this new baby from being born, it's supposed to be born today. Because the soul isn't ready, God is changing her due date for the Gilgal to come. Who says you can do that just because you have an external calculation? To put it in other words, would it be fair if a doctor in your lifetime went over to you and said, listen, there's a guy next door, a very sweet guy, he needs a spleen. I'm just going to take yours. What do you mean you're going to take mine? I need one too. He needs one. We're going to take it. If you view a dead person, that's it, it's over, there's nothing left of it, then yeah, that's the attitude. If you view a dead person, no, there's a whole new life here beginning, and there's continuity that's being delayed. So you can't just go ahead and say, well, it's for medical research, so I'm going to go ahead and do this. And so that's one point that he brings up. Another point they bring up is that it defiles the dead. You're defiling the body. On the other hand, from these chuvas, it's understood that this is only because there isn't a current pikuach nefesh situation. We don't view pikuach nefesh. Let me say it from this point. This also now touches upon the idea of organ transplants, which is a whole other subject, and I don't want to get into it now because it's very long and complex. But it just touches on the idea of organ transplants. One of the main points of discussion regarding whether you can donate organs when a person can sign. Oh, that's your... Right.
On the way here, I was accosted by this group.
Oh, okay. Okay, so maybe we'll discuss it next week.
Okay, you want to hold on to it?
Oh, you want to say, okay, I don't know this specific one. Oh, maybe I do know this one. Regarding a person signing for organ transplant. Let's keep off the subject just for this point. So one of the things that the matir, that those who say it's mutter, or encouraged to do, is based on the following fact. This individual he's not looking for, a skin graft. Oh, he needs you have such a beautiful face. He also wants this beautiful face. He wants to go and now grab somebody's skin. These are people who are going to die if they don't get these organs. Pikuach nefesh pushes off the whole Torah. Pushes off Shabbos, it pushes off Yom Kippur. So why doesn't it push off burying the dead? It should be just like any other mitzvah that gets pushed off in Pikuach nefesh. So I agree with you that this individual has, there's a baby waiting to be born, he needs to move on, it's defying the mitzvah. But Pikuach nefesh, Pikuach nefesh, to save a Jewish life, pushes off the whole Torah. So, if an autopsy, forget about organ transplants, just an autopsy, they're not taking anything out of him, they're just looking, opening up and looking. If an autopsy can help save someone's life who's sick, so apply the same thing. So when Rabbi Yehuda and the Poskim explains the following. We only start using the card of Pikuach Nefesh. We have a current case right now in front of us that has this current illness, and knowledge through the autopsy of this illness can help save his life. Possible, they agree, go ahead, do the autopsy to save another life. But to generally just donate a body for medical research, you don't have the Pikuach Nefesh aid in front of you right now. You don't know if this information will ever be used. And as they write, that most of the bodies are actually never used for anything of fruition. And therefore, that's why they paskin, you cannot donate your body for medical research. Many people in the world, they pass away, they donate their bodies. They have medical classes, I don't think in the United States, but definitely in Europe, where they have a cadaver there. A live cadaver, a real cadaver.
Every medical school.
Huh?
Up until recently, every medical school.
Yeah, a live cadaver.
Every doctor had to do.
Yeah. In the United States,
Very
they do
low,
on real
yeah.
cadavers? Okay.
A dead cadaver.
Well, now it's,
What I mean is that
Yeah.
it's not,
It's not a dummy.
it's not a dummy. It's
Today
a
they
real
do a lot
body.
of- today-
I didn't know it's legal in the United States.
Today they do dummies also. A lot of
they have
You're
much
saying
more
it's legal in the United
sophisticated
States.
things
dummies.
now than,
Yeah.
Autopsy is also done just to find out what the real cause of death when they're not sure of the cause of death.
Well, one second, that's for, okay, correct, so, 1 second. So why they want to know the cause of death? Who cares what the cause, the guy
The
died,
family
what
wants to
difference?
know.
So, okay, so that definitely is not allowed just for the family to know for in Jewish law. What difference does it make? So if a person, well, maybe it can help, in 10 years, 20 years, if we know the family history of some kind of, no, you can't. So that's where the tshuva comes in. There has to be an immediate threat that can have a possibility of an immediate, something of assistance. But if it's just medical research, so it doesn't work.
Family knowledge.
And criminal investigation.
Okay, so we'll get the criminal in a moment, but,
But you were in the process of giving other reasons why burning a body is not permissible.
no, burning a body, we finished with that.
You did? You got everything in there?
Burning a body, we said the two main things is that it transgresses the burial command and negative command against the laying, and that it defiles the body. We went from there to the autopsy.
Okay.
So far what we have established that an autopsy is only allowed in these very, very specific mitigating circumstances, which is basically close to none, okay, for this circumstance to be created. Now, regarding a criminal investigation, so that of course completely negates what you suggested. Oh, the family is interested in knowing why he died. Absolutely, us would do an autopsy for that reason. Now, in most cases, in all cases, in fact, that the police are demanding an autopsy, it's not because they just want to know cause of death, so they have something to write. It's because they have a suspicion, okay? They will not be demanding an autopsy for just what to write in the death certificate. So, in such a case, we now face a little bit of a dilemma, because first, number one, the Torah itself agrees on the necessity of catching killers. We don't want killers on the loose. So if somebody had something to do with this death, we need to find him and we need to put him away. That's number one. Number two, if this person was murdered, he will not get any rest till the murderer is found. This is a counter Zohar. Till now, we brought the Zohar saying we have to bury right away. The soul can't move on. It's like the wife. You can't move on to another wife. You can't move to another mission. Well, the Zohar also explains, brought him over Yapik, something very interesting about a murder victim. A person who was murdered cannot move on with his life, his new life, until that murderer is locked up, found, and pays a price. And it says that he, day in, day out, goes to the prosecution office in Atzilus, in the world of Atzilus, knocks on the door and demands justice be done, and that this murderer be caught. And he doesn't rest. So the
You
concept
cannot
of...
rest in peace.
Exactly. There is no resting in peace until... And it's very interesting that this idea, which is from the Zohar, is everybody pretty much agrees to it. Everyone agrees that, everyone uses the terms that, they can't rest in peace. Now the victim can finally rest in peace. Where do they get that from? It's not made up. The victim cannot rest in peace. It cannot move on. And the Zohar says it does not move on. It day in, day out demands justice, and it screams for justice, and that's why in Halacha it's brought down in Shulchan Aruch that we don't do tahara to the mace, someone who was murdered. We don't do tahara.
The Chicago situation.
Anyone who's murdered, the 10 Jews murdered now on Shabbos, we don't do tahara. Exactly the way they were murdered. Any soldier who dies in battle here in Israel, anybody who was killed in a terrorist attack, there's never tahara done. Exactly the way they are found, they are buried. That
With their garments.
I remember when I was first taught this as a chaplain in the Israeli army. So we were doing training in reserves about 10 years ago to 9 years ago near the Gaza border, and basically the front lines of Golani were going to go into Gaza, and we were basically getting training to prepare for bodies. It was real life training to prepare for how to deal with bodies that come in. And at that time, I didn't know anything of Hilchos Machas. I never learned or studied the laws of dealing with death. And so when I asked them, well, when do we do the Torah process? So the chaplain who was teaching said, no, there is no Torah. We never do Torah in the army. Nobody does Torah in the army. We've never done Torah in the army before. It's like, what do you mean? This is the Halacha.
And what is the reason again?
Oh, so what's the reason? The reason there's a few reasons, but one of the reasons explained is in order for the mace, the soul of this murdered individual, to get closure, his murderer needs to be caught. In order for that soul to be ignited, to be caught, killed, justice done to him. In order for that his soul to be ignited, to be motivated, to move forward with his case, not lose hope or not just, let's move on with life. So we leave the body the way it is. The soul sees the body, its a vengeance is raised, its wrath is raised constantly, and every day it goes and demands justice. That's one of the reasons why it demands justice from God.
By not doing the tahara, it keeps it.
It's not by not doing the tahara, by leaving the mace in the current state that it's found.
Bearing it the way it was.
Exactly.
Yes. It does what?
With the same clothing, we don't take anything off. Exactly the
Gives
same.
it more motivation to
It
seek
basically,
justice.
it reminds the soul of the way of his death, of how he died, and he seeks justice, and demands justice against the murderer.
It helps the authorities catch the murderer and the guy come to justice? Is that what you're
Well,
saying?
We're talking about up above. Yeah.
we're talking about spiritually, but 100%. The same, when people say, the soul of the victim is haunting the murderer, in Judaism, it's a very real concept. It's brought down that the soul of the victim haunts the murderer. It is looking for that murderer to die. That it's usually the sources that discuss this talking about a guy murdering a Jew.
Yeah, but here when
It actually doesn't
if they
discuss
catch
it
him, they
chicken.
put him into a 5-star pension.
So, well,
And then they get
then you're right. I
released for
agree with
good
you.
behavior.
The soul does not rest in peace until they do real action. So it's very important that the terrorists be put to death and that people get the death penalty. Very important.
Death or life imprisonment, you said, just
Life
justice.
in prison is a pension.
It has to be death? Well, that's terrible. Then what about...
Well, that's Lashon of the Zohar.
They don't kill every Arab terrorist. They
I understand.
Sure.
Lashon of the Zohar it's demanding death
Death.
till the person dies.
They should. On the spot, they should.
Nobody should kill.
From Chicago, this guy the young man who died with the
That's
murder.
why, it
He could
says
be in death row for 20 years.
100%. But don't worry, the soul will torment this man's life. We shouldn't think, it's so unfair what these people, and it is, of course, unfair, but we shouldn't think as if they're getting away with it. They're not getting away with it. According to Kabbalah, they're being haunted.
Well, these Arabs are very proud of what they did and so on. They killed a Jew.
Okay, and that's why, by the way, when we mention a person who was murdered, it says you're supposed to say Hashem Yikum Damam, in that same sentence with the person, with the victim. And saying that again arouses the anger and the vengeance against that person upstairs. So these are different things.
What do we say? What do we say?
Chayat Adam, they're not gonna be affected by it. They're animals.
Okay, next week we will begin another subject. This is our Parshas.
We'll have a new mayor, we'll have a new subject, we'll have
Sure.